There is an expectation that when we look at a map of a place like South Carolina, its low country marshes, its red clay upstate, its long slow rivers, we are looking at a land whose story has been neatly told: plantations and ports, civil wars and coastal tourism, the ordinary sweep of history recorded in dates and markers. But beneath the familiar names and the tourist postcards there are places that refuse the tidy lines of the textbooks. They keep their own clocks, their own odd geometries, their own old and stubborn silences. Imagine, for a moment, that you fly above the coast at dawn and the fog is a thin white film, and below it the marshes are not only marshes but rings and ridges, boulders etched with faces, trade scars carved across a riverbank, a curious quarry where soapstone was gouged out in ways that do not match what we thought we knew about who lived here and when. The contrast is immediate: what we expect, settler maps, dates carved in stone, versus what we find when we look carefully, stubborn anomalies, objects that don't sit comfortably inside our current stories. That friction between expectation and mystery is the tension that pulls us into a deeper story, one that asks us to pause and listen to the land itself. Today we are going to walk, in imagination and in evidence, through a handful of these stubborn places, sites in South Carolina where fragments and rings and stones and buried footprints keep asking the same quiet question: who made this, and why? I promise we are not going to be content with the easy answers, and we will let the evidence speak for itself: radiocarbon dates, quarry scars, the alignment of a shell ring, the stratigraphy of a site cut into swampy clay. But we will also be mindful that science, for all its power, sometimes encounters anomalies that refuse tidy explanation. In those places myth and hypothesis, rumor and method collide. We are going to hold several voices at once: the archaeologist reading the strata, the old local who remembers a tale about a cursed mound, the skeptical scientist who says, "natural formation," and the storyteller who whispers, "lost voyage," or "giants." You, listening, will be invited to imagine walking those foggy trails at dawn, to run your hand along a weathered petroglyph, to picture ancient drums echoing through tidal reeds. And I will push you, gently and insistently, to balance wonder with skepticism, to ask which parts of the story rest on hard dates, and which float on oral memory and myth. What follows is not a checklist of mysteries but a set of encounters. Each segment will introduce a site, place it in time with the best available dates, lay out what archaeologists and historians have found, and then open the door wide to the competing theories, the conservative and the radical, the plausible and the speculative. I will not pretend we can solve these mysteries in a single telling, but I will bring you the evidence and the voices and, where appropriate, the small sensational threads that make stories stick in the mind: giant bones whispered about in taverns, cursed stones that bring storms, lost tribes whose songs drift on the wind. These are not urban legends I picked up in a bar. They are cultural residues layered on top of real archaeological problems. We'll treat those residues seriously because the way people remember a place often preserves fragments of truth that the lab tests have yet to reconstruct. As we go, I ask you to keep 3 things in your pocket. First, hold a respectful skepticism. Ask what can be tested and what cannot. Second, allow wonder. If nothing else, these places remind us that the past is stranger than our neat narratives. Third, consider the human cost of the past. These are not just curiosities. They are traces of people who fed and mourned and traded and built here. When a mound or a ring or a quarry resists our explanations, it is not simply a puzzle to be solved. It is an invitation to remember that history is a conversation, sometimes interrupted, sometimes continuing in the soil beneath our feet. We will begin in the low country and then move inland, a site where stone flakes have raised the question of how early humans reached the Americas. The circular shell rings that crop up like fossilized settlements along the coast, a quarry where soapstone was chipped away into unknown uses, the petroglyph face stones tucked in a creek bed, the teased-out remains of a Spanish colonial outpost whose footprint rewrites parts of 16th century contact, and finally a great earthen hill that in a flat landscape reads like a deliberate act of monumental human work. Each place offers dates and data and then a stubborn series of questions. For some the data points to a clear explanation, for others it only deepens the mystery. Where evidence is contested, I'll be clear about who disputes whom and on what grounds. Let me be blunt about an important part of this storytelling. We will sometimes use the language of myth, lost tribes, giants, cursed stones, not because these are the academically sanctioned conclusions, but because myth sits beside fact in the human mind and because myths are themselves a kind of evidence. They show what people feared, what explanations they offered when the tools of modern archaeology were not at hand. When the archaeologist meets the storyteller, each learns from the other. The scientist brings radiocarbon curves and stratigraphy. The storyteller brings the ache of memory and a map of human imagination. Something like truth usually sits between them. So picture this: you and I walk a muddy inlet, the air cold and wet, salt on our lips, wind catching the white of great egrets. We are moving toward a ring that, from the air, looks like a thumbprint on the marsh. The edges are crisp in a way that the surrounding detritus is not. Shells form a rim, midden material piled in an approximation of a circle. For decades these rings were catalogued as refuse heaps. After all, shell middens accumulate where people eat. But why the ring? Why the repetition? Why here and now, and not someplace else? Scientists have the dates. They have the bones and the pottery and the pollen that tell of environment and season. Yet the ring insists on asking, did people deliberately make this a ring for ceremony, for astronomy, for social gatherings, or is it what remains of daily life that, through time, took on a circle shape because of tides and erosion? That question is, in miniature, the shape of our whole journey. We will not only read the dates, we will listen for the human stories that those dates represent. The child who learned to make a net at the ring's edge, the craftsman who walked miles to a soapstone quarry to fashion a bowl, the soldier who slept and dreamed near a mound and drew a map that later became a clue for archaeologists. If you like, you may imagine drums in the night, voices rising and falling like the tide, the glint of a polished stone in a firelight. But always we will return to the evidence, because mystery without evidence is gossip, and evidence without imagination can be a kind of blindness. Our approach will be equal parts curiosity and respect, curiosity for the unknown and respect for the actual lives these places once held. Before we step into our first specific encounter, a note about language. When I say, we still don't know, I mean something precise. I mean that multiple hypotheses exist, some testable and some less so. I mean that the data at hand underdetermines a single explanation. And I mean that part of the wonder of archaeology is the ongoing dialogue between fresh methods and stubborn anomalies. So don your boots, hold your skepticism close, and let your imagination loosen a little. We'll begin where controversy burns brightest, a site whose stone chips and charcoal flecks have made some call it a frontier of human migration, and others call it a trick of geology. Picture yourself standing beside a shallow, worked-out pit, picking up flakes that might be tools or might be the scatterings of time. Picture the slow, careful sieving of layers, the lab's hum, the radiocarbon dates being read aloud. Now breathe in that smell of damp earth and cedar ash. You are at the edge of a question that asks how early the first peoples of this land arrived, and whether the maps we've trusted must be redrawn. The first place we will examine is a site that sits inland from the coastal plain, where stone and clay have been arguing for years, its artifacts and stratigraphy both stubborn and fascinating. We will look at the claims and the counterclaims, the thin glimmers of evidence that have pushed some to say, pre-Clovis, and others to caution, natural breakage. We will try to understand why a handful of flakes in certain layers can become the fulcrum of a story about human arrival on a continent. We will let the site speak through the language of dates and doubts and let you imagine what, if the most daring claims prove true, would have to be true about ancient voyagers pushing deeper into a continent far earlier than most had accepted. So with that, step with me across the faint ridge and into the first chapter of our walk through South Carolina's unsolved ancient mysteries. Picture the sky thinning, the marsh breathing, and the land keeping its secrets in layers of clay and shell. The story here will be one of patient digging, loud disagreements, quiet finds, and the imagination required to hold both the known and the unknowable at once. Our first stop is a place that archaeologists and amateurs alike touch with caution and with hope, a field where the flakes of stone might be the first notes of a much older song. At the Topper site, on the banks of a low river that will not appear on the tourist map but which the locals know by a dozen names, someone began to hand-fashion stone in the way human beings have done for hundreds of millennia. The story of Topper is the story of a single excavation that refused to be tidy. As diggers went deeper and deeper into the stratified soil, they found flakes and what some interpreted as modified cobbles and layers that, by radiocarbon and stratigraphic association, belonged to times earlier than the classic Clovis horizon. If Clovis, fluted spear points associated with the earliest widely accepted human presence in North America, marks a cultural and chronological line at roughly 13,000 years ago, then the suggestion that artifacts at Topper belonged to older horizons raised a provocative possibility that humans, or human-like toolmakers, had been on the eastern seaboard thousands of years earlier than the standard model suggested. That claim is not made lightly. It carries implications for migration routes, for the timing of coastal versus inland occupation, and for the methods by which early peoples exploited and moved through the landscape. But here's where it gets tricky, layer upon layer of debate. The proponents of an early date pointed to stone flakes found in deep stratigraphic contexts, associated with charcoal and organics that gave very early radiocarbon ages, and they argued that the flakes' retouch patterns and fracture mechanics suggested intentional napping rather than the random flaking of natural processes. Supporters suggested dates that pushed human activity back significantly, perhaps into the range of 16,000 to 20,000 years before present or older, opening the door to bold reconstructions of early colonization routes that included coastal navigation or long-distance movement across ice-free corridors earlier than once thought. Still, for all the evidence presented, many in the archaeological community have urged caution. Critics of the pre-Clovis interpretation have suggested alternate geological explanations, that some of the deeper layers represent redeposited debris, that natural processes, burrowing animals, cryoturbation, or ancient fires, could produce features and breaks in stone that mimic human flaking, or that the radiocarbon samples were affected by contamination or misassociation. The threshold between definite artifact and geological fracture is, in such debates, where careers and reputations sometimes hinge. And the dispute is not petty, it is fundamental. If the Topper assemblage truly demonstrates human-made tools in pre-Clovis contexts, then an entire chapter of the peopling of North America must be revised. If, instead, the deeper flakes are natural, then Topper remains an important site for studying later occupation, but not a rewriting of first migration timelines. Picture yourself there at dawn. The ground is cold, a pale mist rising from a nearby stream, and you are crouched with a brush in your hand, uncovering a small white flake whose edges catch the first light. The archaeologist beside you points out the cortex, the bulb of percussion, the platform, those features that signal an intentional strike. You feel the small weight of the flake between your fingers and understand why some people have felt that electric twinge of discovery. This could be a tool in the raw. But now imagine, as the sun rises, that someone else walks up and says, gently, "Look at the surrounding sediment, see how it warped under an ancient heat. See how the matrix contains root casts and broken cobbles? That pattern is consistent with natural fracturing." The moment is one of suspended judgment. Both readings of the same object are possible, depending on the wider context you choose to privilege. There are multiple voices here. Field archaeologists who protectively guard their stratigraphy, geologists who point to the mechanical stresses that can mimic napping, and a few enthusiasts whose public pronouncements inflate the most sensational interpretations. All these voices have their reasons. The data themselves are not mute. Radiocarbon labs have red charcoal samples that sit at the edge of their measurement ranges. Lithic analysts have catalogued flake attributes that suggest human manipulation. Geomorphologists have mapped the river's depositional history and shown episodes of high-energy flow that could disturb deeper materials. The result is a layered debate where the simplest answer is rarely the right one. Either a site like Topper contains early human-made artifacts and rewrites migration models, or it is an object lesson in the caution required when interpreting complex landscapes. Now, let's be fair, archaeology is rarely clean. Sediments mix, animals burrow, floods rearrange, and human error happens. That is precisely why the Topper story is so compelling. it sits at the intersection of careful field method and big picture questions. For the conservative scientist, Topper is a reminder that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, clear stratigraphic relationships, repeated contexts, and artifacts that cannot plausibly be explained by natural processes. For the more adventurous scholar, the site sits as one promising hint among many from across the Americas that the timing and routes of human colonization are more complex than the Clovis first model allowed. There is also a mythic element that attaches itself to places like this. When early dates were first suggested in the public press, speculative accounts sprouted. Tales of lost bands who came before the known waves, of ancient shorelines patrolled by seafarers who left tools along the marsh edges and then vanished when sea levels rose. Those images are seductive. They allow us to imagine small, brave communities testing unfamiliar coastlines tens of thousands of years ago. Yet the myth remains an overlay. It may be beautiful, but it must be sifted from the core data with the same careful strokes used on the dirt. Still, for all the evidence and argument, we are left with an open end. We still don't know, definitively, whether the earliest traces here are the product of human hands or of geological happenstance. The very uncertainty makes the site valuable. It is a puzzle box that keeps archaeologists returning with new techniques, refined radiocarbon approaches, micromorphology, wear pattern analysis on the flakes themselves, in the hope of tightening the chain of inference. If you stand there long enough, you will begin to feel the patience of science, slow accumulation, repeated testing, the careful weighing of hypotheses against the sediment's quiet testimony. If you imagine walking the ridge at dusk, the river a dark silver ribbon, you might notice the landscape's deeper contours that once directed human movement, corridors of travel and resource zones where stone and shell and fresh water all came together. You can almost hear, across the millennia, the small noises of life, someone striking a core, the whisper of a hide being stretched, the cautious footfall of a hunter. That sensation, the humanizing of the past, is why places like Topper matter beyond their academic disputes. They connect us to the question of who we are and how we arrived here. Even if the flakes turn out to be natural, the debate itself teaches us about method, about humility, and about the way history is constructed. And then there are the reflective moments. When the lab's hum meets the hush of a marsh evening, what do we owe to the land and its earlier occupants? The story is not simply about who was first. It is about how we remember and how we investigate. It is about the impatience of headlines versus the deep work of layers. For the community nearby, for the descendants of those who later lived on these lands, for the students who traveled to be part of an excavation for a single summer, Topper is not only a contested data point, it is a place that demands careful stewardship, respectful dialogue, and recognition that the past does not belong to a single narrative. We still don't know the full meaning of the flakes under that soil, and perhaps that is a better ending, because the not knowing keeps the work alive. It invites new tests, new eyes, and new conversations between disciplines that sometimes forget to listen to one another. It invites you, standing with cold air in your lungs and the taste of salt on your tongue, to imagine both the slow, patient labor of archaeologists and the quick, hopeful leap of those who dream of rewriting the map of human arrival in the Americas. We are left with a lesson that applies everywhere. The land holds more than the sum of our expectations, and sometimes the smallest chip of stone can open a very large book. Along the coast, where the river mouths breathe into the sea and the marshes glitter with the slow blinking of tide water, there are places where the shoreline itself looks as if someone pressed a thumb into soft clay and left perfect circles of shell and midden behind. These are the shell rings, and their quiet perfection is the kind of mystery that makes you stop and reorient your sense of time and labor. Picture, if you will, a pale curve of oysters and clam shell piled in an almost architectural band along a low bank, the rim rising a head or two above the surrounding marsh plain, the interior depressed and often waterlogged, a rim that from the air reads like a human fingerprint. At first glance it is easy to say these are simply the refuse of repeated clamshell feasts, the ordinary detritus of communities who ate what the sea offered, but the ring's intentionality nags at anyone who studies them closely, their near circularity, their repeated occurrence along a stretch of coast, and in some cases their internal features, like post holes or hearths, suggest that someone shaped refuse into form. that the making of the ring itself was a social act. Imagine walking up to one at dawn, fog clinging to your boots, and running your hand along the compacted strata. There are layers of broken shell, fragments of bone, charred nutshells, and occasional beads and worked stone, all pressed and stepped into concentric bands by generations who kept returning to the same place. These rings are not marginal trash heaps. They are, in many readings, the skeletal architecture of social life, places where people met, where feasts and exchanges and funerary acts might have occurred, where the seasonal pulse of life at the edge of sea and swamp was made visible in a durable, circular form. But here's where it gets tricky. Archaeologists have long argued about scale and function. Were these rings the remains of long-lived, sedentary villages, semi-permanent bases where families returned year after year? Or were they the product of repeated, seasonal aggregations, a kind of place that hosted large groups at times when resources concentrated and social ties were renewed through ceremonial feasting? Some researchers point to internal features, compact floors, hearths, post molds, as evidence that people lived inside or on the rim. Others note that the presence of high quantities of certain shell species, and the seasonality deduced from shellfish growth rings, fits patterns of seasonal visitation, suggesting these rings were social hubs rather than continuous settlements. Still, for all the evidence, there is no single script that fits all rings. Some are small and barely raised, others are massive and complex. Some sit on stable uplands, others on transgressive shorelines now threatened by erosion. The rings are dated broadly to an era when hunter-gatherer groups along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts were intensifying their use of marine resources and experimenting with forms of social complexity that do not map neatly onto later village life. Yet even within that framing there are competing stories about what the rings reveal about social organization, ritual life, and mobility. Now, let's be fair. A few scholars have argued for a more functional explanation that leans heavily on taphonomy and geomorphology. Essentially, that natural processes of deposition, tidal sorting, and human discard combined over centuries to produce ring-like accumulations without any deliberate circular planning. They point out that middens often form in arcs around living surfaces and that animal activity and erosion can accentuate curved shapes. In that view, the rings are emergent features of repeated living and tidal dynamics rather than planned monuments. But other voices insist the rings' repeat presence along long stretches of coastline and their internal structuring points toward intentional design, places where the community invested labor in shaping their refuse into bounded forms, perhaps to contain the dead, concentrate ceremonial activities, or mark the landscape in ways that encoded social memory. For those who see ritual in the rings, the circularity might have cosmological significance, a symbolic mapping of the world edited into the very bones of what people consumed. Some researchers even suggest astronomical alignments or sight lines, rims that face certain rising points of the sun or set of particular stars, so that the ring becomes a kind of calendar or social stage upon which seasonal rites were enacted. Imagine standing in the center of one as the horizon blooms with sunrise and feeling the geometry of the world shift in a way that tells people when to harvest, when to travel, when to hold ceremony. The rings might, in that sense, encode a communal rhythm. There is also the environmental story to contend with. These rings were made in a dynamic coastal environment where sea levels, salinity, and tidal regimes changed over centuries. Some rings formed at times when the coast was more hospitable and resources were abundant. Others may have been constructed during periods of stress, when concentrated foraging and ritual helped reinforce social bonds vital for survival. Still, for all the environmental reconstructions, the rings challenge simplistic models that equate complexity with agriculture and permanent towns. Here, on the edges of the sea, people may have achieved significant social complexity, hierarchies, ritual specialists, long-distance exchange, while remaining mobile or seasonally mobile, exploiting a wealth of marine resources. The rings force us to expand our definitions of what counts as social intensification. The mythology that accretes to these places is as rich as the earth itself. Folk stories from later centuries tell of ghostly feasts, of shells that sing when you turn them to your ear, of rings that mark the spots where giants once sat and broke open oysters with their bare hands. A few local tales spin darker yarns, curse rings that bring bad weather to those who dig, or rings that are the resting places of people whose names were erased by history. Those myths are not archaeological proof, of course, but they matter for other reasons. They show how later inhabitants of the landscape read the material past and folded it into moral tales about stewardship and respect. Myth also works as a kind of memory bridge. An echo of large gatherings may transform, over generations, into a story of a giant's meal or a supernatural boundary. Listening to those stories gives us another angle on the human meaning of the rings. They were clearly significant landmarks in the later cultural geography of the coast. Critically, the shell rings have produced artifacts that complicate simple narratives. Groundstone tools, carved bone pins, shell gorgets, and beads imply craft specialization and some degree of exchange. Chemical analysis of some shells and animal remains sometimes indicates far-reaching trade in items that came from different ecological zones, suggesting that the rings were nodes in broader networks. But again, the evidence is messy. Some rings are artifact-rich, others are sparse. Some show clear stratigraphy and long occupation sequences, others are thin scatter across a vulnerable shoreline. Because of their coastal position, many rings have also suffered erosion and sea level rise, which both threatens future research and complicates interpretation of earlier finds made decades ago before modern stratigraphic techniques existed. Now let us imagine you are there with a small trowel, stepping gingerly around a surface hearth whose charcoal flecks have given a radiocarbon age indicating many centuries of repeated use. You crouch and see bead blanks, unfinished pieces, mixed with the shells. You hear, perhaps only in your imagination, voices piling fish and talking about marriages and rites of passage. You might feel the resonance of a place that anchored memory across generations, a kind of social hearth whose physical rim kept a community's stories intact on the landscape. For some, that sense of human continuity is the ring's most important message. They are markers of a community's long-term connection to a place, deposited and shaped by people who knew precisely where their kin were buried and which tide to follow at dusk. For others, the rings are experimental social laboratories, places where groups tested new alliances, displayed power through feasting, and reproduced social identities without the trappings of full sedentism. As scholars dug deeper into the shells, they also found hints that some rings involved curated deposition, selected bones, curated artifacts placed deliberately into certain zones, perhaps as offerings or as part of mortuary practices. That suggests a ritual economy in which some items were more than trash. They were meaningful signs placed with intention. But then comes the counter-reading. What if those patterns are the result of differential preservation and recovery? What if the places that show more curated deposition are simply the ones less damaged by tides and storms, and our sample is biased? This methodological self-awareness is crucial. Archaeology is not a neutral reading of the past but a conversation with the residues that time and environment have allowed to remain. The rings thus force practitioners to be humble about what can be known and bold about what might be proposed. There are also tantalizing suggestions of social differentiation tied to some rings. A few sites show evidence that certain parts of the ring were associated with high-status materials: ornamented shell, exotic stone, elaborate bone modifications, while others were more quotidian. If such patterns hold up, they may indicate that the rings were stages upon which social ranking was enacted, perhaps through conspicuous consumption or controlled feasting. Again, it's tempting to make comparisons with later chiefdoms, but we must avoid teleology. The rings may have supported forms of status and complexity unlike anything we know from later archaeological sequences. The human imagination, after all, is adept at generating 1,000 forms of social life, and shell rings might represent unique local solutions to social and environmental challenges. We still don't know precisely why so many of these rings were built in concentric form, what exact combination of ritual, economy, and environment produced that circular architecture, and how the people who made them moved between mobility and rootedness. We still don't know whether the ring's form was a practical solution to refuse management that later acquired symbolic meaning, or whether it was always an emblem of social order and cosmology. We still don't know how much the stories that later colonists told about these places preserve fragments of earlier memory, and how much they are the inventions of a new era seeking to explain the alien traces beneath their plows. What we can say, with confidence, is that the rings are neither trivial nor simply decorative. They are the marks of a people shaping their environment and their social world in ways that demand our attention. Stand in the center as the sun arcs across the salt sky and you will feel the weight of generations that shaped those shells into form. Listen for the imagined drums, for the laughter and argument and bargaining that might have completed the ring's social life, and know that those sounds, lost to recorded history, are what makes the rings less an archaeological curiosity and more a kind of palimpsest of human gathering and memory. At the foot of the Piedmont ridges, where mottled soapstone boulders peel out of the earth like the knots in an old tree, there are places where people once came not to hunt but to chip. Soapstone quarries where the pale, greasy rock was shaped into vessels and ornaments, and where the scale of the labor raises questions about organization, trade, and intentionality. The Pacolet soapstone quarries and related steatite procurement sites in Spartanburg and Cherokee counties show clear, repeated evidence of human quarrying. Large outcropping boulders with cup-like depressions, concentrations of flake steatite debris, and rough, partially worked bowls still attached to their parent rock. Archaeologists date much of this activity to the late Archaic period, roughly between 300 and 500 BC, when people in the southeastern United States increasingly made heat-tolerant bowls from soapstone rather than relying exclusively on woven baskets or fragile ceramic vessels. And they did so in ways that suggest both technical skill and sustained investment. The boulders themselves bear the scars, circular grooves where workers cut around a mass, leverage notches where the detached piece could be pried out, and surrounding middens of flakes that testify to repeated return visits. These are not casual, one-off acts of opportunism. They are the traces of organized quarrying whose products, soapstone bowls and ornaments, turned up not only nearby but in sites well beyond the immediate procurement area, which suggests networks of exchange in which relatively bulky items were carried and traded across the landscape. But here's where it gets tricky. The archaeological visibility of quarrying invites multiple stories about scale and social meaning. One straightforward interpretation is utilitarian. People needed durable cooking vessels, and soapstone, with its heat-resistant properties, was ideal. From that perspective, quarrying is a technical response to a practical problem, an ingenious reworking of local geology into a useful form. Yet when you look closer, patterns emerge that refuse the merely practical explanation. Some quarries show evidence of repeated, sometimes intense labor concentrated in specific spots, almost as if certain outcrops were managed or controlled by particular groups. Other quarries sit on landscape knobs that would have been visible from a distance, acting like territorial signposts. The presence of unfinished items and standardized shapes at multiple quarries hint at shared styles or production norms, which in turn could point toward craft specialization. If so, then we have a picture of communities investing surplus labor into producing durable goods that circulated as both practical items and social objects, perhaps gifts, trade goods, or even status markers. That raises the question: were these bowls merely bowls, or did they carry meaning beyond their use? Do we have here a proto-industry whose products underwrote new forms of social connection? Now, let's be fair, some of the patterns we read as organization may be the accidental outcome of resource distribution. Soapstone is available in certain geologic zones. Communities who happened to live nearby naturally harvested it. Moreover, the prehistoric economy of the late Archaic was flexible and locally varied. Some groups moved seasonally and returned to special places for tasks that required space and tools, while others may have been more sedentary and organized quarrying on a household or communal basis. But even allowing for such variation, the scale of the boulder scars and the recurrence of certain morphologies of bowls across sites suggest more than mere ad hoc convenience. Ethnographic analogy and microware analysis of finished and unfinished pieces indicate that soapstone bowls were not only heat-resistant cooking aids but were sometimes deposited in graves or found among exotic trade goods, hints that they could also function as social tokens, objects embedded in gift economies or ritual practice. Again, the lines blur between utility and meaning. The quarrying techniques themselves add to the fascination. Historical and ethnographic accounts of soapstone extraction elsewhere describe methodical grooves cut around a desired shape, followed by levering and chiseling that created bowls ready for final smoothing. Archaeologists working at the southeastern quarries have found circular cut patterns in adjacent depressions exactly like those historic descriptions. An experimental replication shows that producing a single bowl could take many hours of skilled labor. That labor, repeated across generations, suggests organized work rhythms that would have required not just technical knowledge but also social arrangements for labor sharing, training, and possibly ritual rites to oversee resource access. Imagine standing on a warm summer ridge, the sun baking the exposed stone, while a small group of people synchronizes blows and passes tools in a rhythm that is both practical and social. You can almost hear the cadence of pecking, the soft conversation of apprenticeship, the occasional holler, as a heavy piece is pried free. Those human sounds are the living music behind the archaeological pattern. Yet the soapstone quarries also generate larger puzzles about movement and exchange across the southeast. If the raw material and finished vessels are found far from their source, how did they travel? Was there an established exchange network linking the Piedmont quarries to coastal and riverine communities, perhaps along the same routes later used by historic trade networks? Some finds suggest long-distance movement, soapstone vessels discovered in contexts hundreds of kilometers away, sometimes alongside other non-local goods like exotic lithics or shell ornaments. That implies not only trade but also social relationships that crossed ecological zones, upland producers connecting with lowland fishers, or craftsmen specializing in forms that were desired by faraway communities. Such patterns complicate any tidy model of prehistoric economy as purely local and subsistence-oriented. The soapstone evidence opens the door to a vision of a prehistoric Southeast stitched together by material ties and social obligations. But then again, the archaeological record is patchy. Some apparent long-distance finds may represent later curated heirlooms rather than active trade in fresh goods, so interpretation must proceed cautiously. There is a mythic overlay to the quarries as well. Local legend sometimes speaks in larger-than-life images. Boulders broken by the hands of giants, bowls so large they could serve whole families at once, or secret caches of unfinished bowls hidden in sinkholes. Those tales, while not literal evidence, matter. They are cultural reflections of how later people encountered and tried to explain the peculiar, industrial scars in the landscape. In certain accounts, the quarries are sacred places, their boulders speaking to a depth of time that settler memory could not easily translate. Those stories can also be cautionary. Some whisper that disturbing a quarry will bring bad luck or angry weather, a folkloric rule that may have functioned historically to protect fragile sites from overexploitation. If myth sometimes masks historical fact, it can also preserve a layer of respect and memory that scholars would be foolish to ignore. We still don't know the full social architecture behind the soapstone industry, the exact mechanisms of labor organization, the ritual rules that might have governed access to the boulder outcrops, and the precise geographic extent of the trade networks that carried the bowls out from quarry to distant tables. We still don't know whether some quarries were specialized production centers run by groups who monopolized certain techniques, or whether they were more open and shared by neighboring communities according to customary rules. We still don't know the intangible meanings these objects carried for their makers and users. Were they domestic tools only? Or were some so sacred that they were deposited in ritual contexts as part of life cycle ceremonies? Standing beside a hollowed-out boulder, with the scrape marks catching late sunlight, you feel the weight of those unknowns, a human industry whose evidence is tactile and demanding, but whose full story remains just beyond our grasp. A few hours' drive and a few cultural layers away, on a cool creek near historic Haggard Mill, there is a rock wall that bears the careful scratching of human hands. Images and figures etched into stone that survive as one of the most concentrated collections of petroglyphs in South Carolina, and which open up a different kind of riddle about meaning and continuity. The Haggard Creek Petroglyph Site, also known as the South Carolina Petroglyph Site, contains dozens of rock carvings, human-like figures, geometric forms, and enigmatic faces, carved into a large outcrop of bedrock and now protected in a small pavilion and museum that allows visitors to see the art in situ. The stones include not only the carved figures but also a soapstone boulder nearby showing partial bowl preparation, linking the rock art landscape to quarrying and craft. Archaeologists and rock art specialists have debated the age and exact cultural affiliation of the petroglyphs. While most agree they are prehistoric, placing them somewhere in a broad arc that may include late Archaic to Woodland periods, pinning precise calendar dates to rock art is notoriously difficult without direct associations. Nonetheless, stylistic similarities to other southeastern rock art and regional artifact assemblages provide a circumstantial case that these images were made by native peoples long before European contact. But here's where it gets tricky. The petroglyphs invite many layers of interpretation that rarely resolve into a single, tidy reading. One reading takes the iconography seriously as a symbolic system. The human figures, some with raised arms or radiating lines, may be clan markers, spirit beings, or depictions of ceremonies. The geometric forms, circles, spirals, cupules, could represent cosmological concepts, planetary bodies, or maps of local waterways and resources. In some traditions of rock art interpretation, repeating motifs indicate shared mythologies or ceremonial repertoires that tied distant groups together. The distribution of similar motifs across the southeast suggests a communicative field in which images served as durable, nonverbal carriers of meaning. If so, then the Haggard Creek figures are not idle doodles but active participants in a web of meaning connecting people across space and time. Now, let's be fair, skeptics urge restraint. Rock art is tricky because the images are often isolated from datable contexts. We may have nearby pottery, sherds, or charcoal, but submitting the rock itself to a calendar requires rare conditions. The result is that stylistic comparisons and contextual inference dominate interpretation, and those can be slippery. Moreover, many petroglyphs have been exposed to weathering and modern vandalism, which complicates readings that depend on fine-line details. For Haggard, the protection of the site inside a museum structure has helped preserve and interpret the images, but it also came after centuries in the open and a period in the 19th and early 20th century when the interest in Indian curiosities led to removal of artifacts and unsystematic investigations. That messy history is part of the site's archaeological biography and must temper our confidence in neat conclusions. The petroglyphs have also produced serious scholarly debate about function. Were they territorial markers, signposts for travel routes, mnemonic devices for ritual performance, or objects of private devotional practice? Each possibility has different implications for how we imagine the societies that made them. If mnemonic, then the stones might have been used in ritual rehearsals, a sort of rock stage for learning the myths. If territorial, they are visible claims to landscape. If devotional, they are material loci of personal and communal prayer. In some cases like Haggard, the presence of human figures invites readings about ancestor veneration or shamanic practice, particularly when combined with nearby burial mounds or habitation features. Yet none of these readings is decisive, and the stones stubbornly withhold the kind of context that would let us choose one over the other. There is also a living cultural dimension that complicates and enriches interpretation. Local communities today, descendants of native peoples, long-term rural residents, and museum stewards, bring competing narratives and priorities to the site. For some, the petroglyphs are a sacred inheritance requiring careful stewardship and consultation with indigenous groups whose oral traditions may hold echoes of meaning. For others, the rocks are a tourist attraction that ties local identity to an ancient, mysterious past. The interplay of these living meanings affects what questions get asked and which preservation measures are adopted. It also means that the stones are not just archaeological objects but active elements in contemporary cultural politics. Who gets to speak for the past, and how the past is displayed? And then there is the sensory experience of the place, which is itself an argument for significance. Imagine standing beneath the outcrop as late sun slants through leaves, the carved faces catching light like shallow bas-reliefs. Imagine tracing with a gloved fingertip the shallow groove of a human figure's arm and feeling the slow compression of time beneath the palm. The site offers a visceral intimacy with makers who left no written record, only images that do a stubborn sort of work, demanding that we think in symbols and gestures rather than sentences. The experience is as much emotional as it is scientific. You feel a connection to hands that reach for the same stones surfaced thousands of years earlier, and that feeling presses us toward humility and curiosity in equal measure. We still don't know the precise dates for most of the Hagrid petroglyphs, the exact social meanings those images held for their makers, or the full extent to which the iconography tied Hagrid to broader regional networks of symbol and practice. We still don't know which motifs are local improvisations and which are legible dialects in a cross-regional pictorial language. Standing before the stones, you sense both the intimacy of the maker's gesture and the wide blankness of the things left unsaid. It is this productive tension, between the carved lion's immediacy and the archaeological silence around it, that keeps scholars and visitors returning to Hagrid Creek with questions and reverence. On a broad, low spit of land where the river breathes into the sea and the sand bleeds into marsh, the ghosts of empire live in the soil, stoneware shards, the edges of olive jars, iron scraps dulled by brackish water. The place the Spaniards called Santa Elena, and the French briefly called Charlesfort before them, sits today in the slow hum of Parris Island's training grounds and protected archaeological parcels, yet beneath that modern overlay lie the remains of one of North America's most consequential early colonial experiments. A 16th-century settlement that pushed the known edges of La Florida northward and left behind an uncomfortable tangle of contact, conquest, and collaboration. The dates are crisp enough in outline: first the French outpost of Charlesfort in 1562, then the Spanish occupation and attempted capital of Santa Elena beginning in the 1560s through the 1580s. But the material record complicates neat historical scripts. Archaeologists have found imported European ceramics, construction features interpreted as fortifications, trade goods intermingled with indigenous pottery, and a stratigraphic record that alternates between the quick hands of colonial excavation and the slower accretions of native occupation. Those finds are not simple footnotes. They are loaded objects that force us to imagine what it meant, in the 16th century, for people of different worlds to meet on this marshy edge. Some of the artifacts, imported majolica, fragmentary olive jars, rotten nails, anchor Spanish presence in time and technology. Other items, like local pottery sherds and food remains, testified to the continual presence and agency of native communities who persisted before, during, and after the European sojourns. The archaeological picture is therefore not a story of replacement but of encounter, sometimes violent, sometimes cooperative, and always ambiguous, and that ambiguity is the core of the site's power to unsettle our tidy national origin tales. But here's where it gets tricky. The written records from the Spanish crown and the fragmentary French reports give one set of names and dates, while the ground speaks in a different grammar: post holes, burned layers, mixed refuse horizons, that resists a single narrative. Some historians have used the documentary archive to tell a story of imperial ambition and failure. Parris Island, Santa Elena, was meant to be a northern bulwark of Spanish power, a demonstration that La Florida could extend as far as the Carolinas and prevent the spread of rival French influence. The archaeology supports that outline in part. There are traces of fort work, Spanish ceramics and layers dated to the late 1500s, and the expected overlay of later English colonial debris, but the human texture is more tangled. The indigenous networks that intersected this zone, the coastal and riverine peoples whose seasonal cycles and trade routes threaded the region, did not vanish when Europeans arrived. Instead, they adapted, engaged, resisted, and sometimes made use of new goods. That interaction left a residue that complicates the story of colonization as a unilateral imposition. Instead, we see evidence of negotiation. European goods moved into indigenous hands, local subsistence patterns persisted, and the landscape itself was negotiated. Who walked where? Who planted near the fort? Who avoided certain marshes because they were haunted by misfortune? Imagine standing on the little rise that still marks the general area of those early forts and looking out across a watery world where languages met at the edge of a bay. You would see the overlap of dug post holes and hearths, and you would feel the strange intimacy of a place that hosted both a small urban experiment and an older, persistent landscape shaped by indigenous stewardship. Multiple contested interpretations swirl around what the Parris Island evidence really means for questions of early contact and colonial endurance. One camp emphasizes the colonial story, the strategic and bureaucratic impulses of imperial Spain, the logistical challenges of maintaining a distant outpost, the eventual withdrawal and neglect that characterized many early colonial efforts. That reading is bolstered by material finds that match Spanish contemporary technologies and by the chronology offered by period documents. Another set of voices insists we foreground indigenous agency, that the presence of European objects in native contexts does not simply mark domination but also selective adoption, adaptation, and exchange. In this latter view, the arrival of European goods might have reshaped local social economies in surprising ways, catalyzing new status displays, altering trade dependencies, or provoking novel alliances, without erasing the core lifeways of the native communities who maintained fishing, planting, and ritual patterns along the coast. A third, more speculative interpretive frame asks whether the very choice of Santa Elena's location, and its subsequent failure, should be read less as a testament to European folly and more as evidence that native control of landscape and resources made long-term colonial endurance difficult without deeper alliances and local knowledge. In other words, the site asks us to consider not only the presence of Europeans, but also the limits of European power in a world they had not built. These competing frames are not merely academic hair-splitting. They shape how we think about the very origins of colonial North America and how we read the moral responsibilities of remembering those origins. There are also more sensational, mythic elements that have attached themselves to Santa Elena over the centuries. Tales of buried Spanish treasure and shipwrecked galleons washed up on secret sandbars mix with local lore about haunted stretches of marsh where the dead of the fort still wander at low tide. Those stories have fueled amateur treasure hunts and informal digs that have, in turn, sometimes compromised stratigraphic contexts and complicated professional research. Yet these legends must be handled carefully. While they can lead to destructive behaviors, they also reveal a cultural hunger to connect directly with a past that seems at once close, an olive jar shard in a garden, and impossibly distant. That hunger is understandable. When you hold a fragment of imported ceramic whose glaze once reflected 16th-century sunlight, you feel a physical link to a distant world. But the archaeologist insists on slower rhythms, careful stratigraphic excavation, secure context, and cautious interpretation, because the stakes here are not merely knowledge but the respectful preservation of places that belong to multiple descendants and stakeholders. The work at Santa Elena has been a model, in some ways, of how long-term archaeological engagement can untangle complex contact histories, repeated excavations over decades, careful cataloging of imported versus local materials, and an emphasis on public interpretation that puts the history into conversation with local communities and descendant groups. That practice does not eliminate ambiguity, but it does create a richer set of voices for understanding what happened on that marshy edge. Stand on a foggy morning on the shore near Parris Island and imagine the small bustle of life. European craftworkers measuring timbers, indigenous fishermen guiding canoes with knowledge of hidden shoals, council fires where translation is attempted, and a sky full of gulls indifferent to human quarrels. The sensory detail grounds the larger debates in human presence. The smells of fish and fire, the small weight of a ceramic rim in your palm, the clamp of salt on a rope. You sense both the banality of daily life and the drama of a world being remade. What makes Santa Elena more than an archaeological curiosity is precisely this entwined human story. The place is a palimpsest where the arrogance of empire, the adaptive creativity of native communities, and the slow sediment of environment meet in ways that refuse simple moral or political closure. We still don't fully know how people negotiated material culture and political power at Santa Elena. The precise mechanisms by which some native groups incorporated European goods while others resisted, the social consequences of trade intermixing, and the degree to which the Spanish project altered long-term trajectories in the region. What we do know is that the site presses us to embrace complexity. Colonialism is not a single story but a braided set of interactions, and those braids can only be read if we attend both to documents and to dirt. Further inland, where the broad floodplain of the Santee River bows like a great palm in a flat country, a different kind of monument rises, a hill in the middle of nowhere that reads like an act of deliberate, monumental human labor. The Santee Indian Mound, part of a broader constellation that includes the Adamson Mounds and other ceremonial complexes, has been known to locals for generations, a 30-foot rise in a landscape otherwise governed by low horizons. These mounds are not anonymous piles of earth. They are engineered spaces that served, at different times, as burial platforms, ceremonial stages, and in later periods, even colonial military emplacements. Archaeologists have found that the mound-building cultures of the coastal plain were capable of sustained, organized labor, moving and shaping vast amounts of earth in a way that required planning, social coordination, and a shared cosmological imagination. The dates for some South Carolina mound complexes place their major construction between roughly AD 1000 and AD 1500, overlapping with what archaeologists call the Mississippian Cultural Horizon, a period of intensified agriculture, social ranking, and regional trade networks in the eastern woodlands, but local sequences and material cultures vary. So each mound must be read on its own terms. Excavations at Adamson and related sites have revealed burial deposits, ritual paraphernalia, pottery types that tie local communities to broader networks, and stratigraphic sequences that indicate repeated episodes of building, use, and reworking over centuries. If shell rings intimate social gatherings at the water's edge, the mounds are their possible civic centers, places where leaders were buried, ceremonies performed, and regional authority asserted through visible landscape alteration. Now, let's be fair, the interpretation of mounds is long contested, and the language we use matters. Early Euro-American observers often called these places temples or forts, projecting Old World categories onto New World structures. Modern archaeologists have been more careful, using osteological analysis, radiocarbon dating, pottery typology, and spatial patterning to reconstruct probable functions while acknowledging uncertainty. There is evidence that some mounds served primarily as burial platforms, places where elites were interred with grave goods as markers of social differentiation, while others had domestic or ceremonial components. At Adamson, for instance, the presence of multiple mounds and associated village areas suggests a community with a long-term stake in that locale, combining mortuary ritual with everyday life. Over time, these complex sites also attracted new uses. Later historic occupants sometimes reused mound tops as forts or lookout points, producing palimpsests where prehistoric ritual meets colonial strategy. The reuse complicates direct readings of original function because the later layers can disturb and mix the older contexts. But it also tells a human story of continuous significance. When people saw a mound centuries later, they still saw a useful, symbolic, or strategic landmark. Competing theories about mound builders' social complexity, their political organization, and the extent of their regional influence animate scholarly debates. One school interprets the mounds as evidence of hierarchical chiefdoms, where centralized authority directed labor and articulated social inequality through burial practices and elite consumption. Another school warns against imposing a strictly hierarchical model and emphasizes local variability, networks of communities with episodic leadership and fluid social bonds that could nevertheless organize large-scale labor for common projects. The archaeological record supports both readings in different places. In some mound complexes you find ostentatious grave goods and evidence of ritual exclusivity. In others, burials are more egalitarian and public. The intuition that monumental labor necessarily equals centralized coercion is thus not guaranteed. Cooperative, ritual-driven labor organized around shared cosmologies could produce comparable earthworks without a strict top-down polity. That ambiguity is productive rather than paralyzing. It forces us to broaden our imagination of what political life might have looked like among the Santee and its neighbors. The mounds also carry an effective power that survives into the modern landscape. Standing at the summit of a gently sloped mound, you feel a shift in horizon and a concentrated sense of presence. The world seems to line up differently, and you sense, for an instant, the social work required to raise such a hill, the family groups hauling earth, the careful placement of burials, the ritual songs that punctuated the labor. Local folklore sometimes refracts that sense of labor into stories of giants or great ancestral figures, while more recent interpretive efforts foreground descendant community connections and the need for respectful curation. The tug-of-war between myth, tourism, scholarship, and descendant claims is a live political question. Who owns the past, and who gets to interpret the dead? Those are not merely academic questions. They have legal and ethical implications for conservation, for public access, and for how museums and agencies present these places to wider audiences. We still don't fully know the precise social mechanisms that produced and maintained the Santee and Adamson mounds, the specific rituals, the social obligations, the seasonal rhythms of labor, and the personal meanings of the burials. But we do know they mattered deeply to people who lived on that landscape across centuries. Standing there, with wind moving through tall grass, you feel an intimacy with lives long gone and a responsibility to treat their remnants with care. We still don't know how many stories remain locked beneath the mound's soil, how many burial sequences await respectful study, how many artifacts lie beyond the reach of surface survey, and which of those artifacts might rewrite our narratives of regional trade and social life. What we do know is that these hills, and the platforms and village spaces around them, are not passive landforms but active archives of human intent, deliberate constructions that mark landscapes with social memory, anchors for political action, and repositories of grief and celebration. In that sense, they are as vital as any library. They contain records written not in ink but in earth, bone, and pottery, and they demand an interpretive generosity that holds both skepticism and wonder in equal measure. You have walked with me from the low, ringed edges of the tide to the high, scoured soapstone outcrops. You have crouched beside flakes that might be tools and stood on earthworks that were once stages for ceremony. And along the way you have felt the tug of two simple truths. First, that material evidence can speak across centuries. And second, that what it says is often ambiguous, sometimes thrilling, sometimes maddening. We brought several kinds of voices into this conversation: the careful tone of the archaeologist bent over a grid, the skeptical voice that asks for clearer stratigraphy, the historian who reads documents like a map of intentions, and the storyteller who cannot help but imagine drums and giants and shipwrecks. Those voices are not accidents. They are the different instruments with which we play the same tune. The place itself, the marsh, the mound, the quarry, the carved rock, changes the melody. Some places demand patient excavation and lab work. Others insist on listening to oral memory and local lore. What ties them together is the same human urge, to make sense of a past that refuses simple description and yet, in its refusal, invites deep connection. Think for a moment about scale. In one hand you hold a small white flake from a deep layer, a seeming nothing that nonetheless might mark a presence earlier than anyone expected. In the other hand you hold the bulky, deliberate weight of an earthwork, the result of labor that required planning and a community willing to carry and deposit thousands of backbreaking loads of soil. Those two objects represent different kinds of argument. One suggests first arrival, the point of entry into a landscape. The other suggests rootedness, an extended social life shaped into monumental form. The shell rings and the soapstone quarries each tell variations on these themes, some groups experimenting with forms of social aggregation without full agricultural dependence, some communities building craft economies and trade networks that knitted uplands to coasts. The petroglyph panels, the imported Spanish shards in a Parris Island trench, the mounds rising from the Santee floodplain, all these marks argue from different angles about the same fundamental human conditions: movement and place, exchange and identity, memory and loss. We must also be honest about the rhetorical power of mystery. Mystery draws us. It sharpens publicity, funds, and the imaginations of both scientists and storytellers. But mystery can also mislead. When prehistoric flakes become proof of an alternative colonization narrative, in the glossy pages of popular magazines, the nuance of stratigraphic debate melts away into a single, sensational claim. When local legends of giant bones circulate without context, scientific method is ignored and sacred places are at risk of damage by treasure hunters seeking spectacle. The ethical balance here is delicate. We want the public to care about these places, but we also want that care to be informed and respectful. That means fighting both sensationalism and the flattening of complexity into a single, easy story. There is a moral dimension to the work that reaches beyond curiosity. Many of the places we have visited are living landscapes for descendant communities, places that hold ancestral graves, that are woven into songs and family memory, and that deserve care that is not only scientific but also political and ethical. Archaeology's past is not innocent. It has been used sometimes to justify dispossession or to exoticize the people whose lives it studies. Modern practice, thankfully, increasingly acknowledges those harms. Collaborative approaches with native communities, transparent stewardship, and an emphasis on returning both artifacts and narrative authority where they belong are becoming standard. This shift matters because it reframes our questions. Instead of asking only, "What happened?" we also ask, "Who has a right to decide what we know and how it is told?" The land holds the physical record, but people hold the stories, the rituals, and the claims. To read one without honoring the other is an impoverished anthropology. At the level of method, the places we have seen also illustrate archaeology's technical evolution. Radiocarbon labs now report dates with calibrated curves that can narrow windows of activity. Micromorphological analysis lets us see the tiny fingerprints of floor use and post holes invisible to an untrained eye. Isotopic and residue analyses tell us what kinds of food were cooked in a bowl or what seashells reveal about diet and seasonality. These tools have a power to reduce ambiguity, but they do not eliminate it. Science is a conversation with matter. New techniques refine the talk, but the matter itself keeps some of its silence. There will always be questions that require more than new machines, questions that benefit from historical documents, from oral memory, from a sensitivity to place that cannot be reduced to numbers. And that is a good thing. It keeps humanistic empathy in the center of material study. Then there is the landscape's temporal fluidity. What we see now is never exactly what ancient people saw. Sea level rises and falls, rivers redirect, forests come and go. Sites once inland become riverine, shorelines retreat and swallow middens. Submerged landscapes off the coast have been erased from surface view. Reefs now hide places that were once habitable ground. That changing canvas complicates interpretation but also deepens it. People did not live in a static world. They navigated shifting resources, adapted to new conditions, and sometimes met misfortune when conditions changed faster than social adaptation would allow. The shell rings, vulnerable to erosion today, remind us how many stories have already been lost to waves. The quarry faces, still visible, record a different kind of endurance, the durability of geology meeting the durability of craft. The mounds, raised like islands in a plain, testify to the intentional shaping of horizon and memory. All these places teach a lesson about human resilience and vulnerability in the face of environmental change, a lesson that grows more relevant as our own era grapples with climate stress. Let us also return to the rumor, those whispers of giant skeletons, of cursed stones, of treasure-laden vessels. I include these not as endorsements but as cultural phenomena worth studying. Legends reveal how later people tried to reconcile the unsettling presence of ancient work in their own lived landscapes. When a field yields a great earthen mound, the mind, hungry for meaning, supplies a mythic explanation: giants, heroes, divine builders. Those myths may obscure actual histories, but they are also tests of cultural memory. Sometimes they contain slivers of truth embedded in symbolic dress. Our job is to parse them carefully, to recognize the kernels of memory they might preserve, while resisting the seduction of literalizing metaphors. In practical terms, we must guard sites against looters for whom myth is a license to destroy. Ethically, we must honor the feelings these legends evoke for local people, even as we work to document and protect the real histories underfoot. There is a final human truth we cannot avoid: these places are encounters with mortality. A mound may hide bones, a midden contains the discarded remains of meals that sustained lives of people whose names are lost. When we handle pottery shards and shell beads, we touch on lives that once mattered to many others. That reality should temper our curiosity with reverence. We are not merely collectors of artifacts, we are stewards of traces. Stewardship demands both the coolness of science and the warmth of human respect. When archaeologists open a grave, they are not only doing science, they are unearthing a person who was loved, mourned, and remembered in ways we can sometimes only faintly reconstruct. That ethical recognition should be the starting point of any study. So what should you do with this mixture of wonder, puzzlement, and ethical weight? First, be curious, but curiously kind. Seek out museum exhibits and professional publications that handle these sites with care. Read the technical summaries, but also attend public lectures and community events that foreground descendant voices. When you visit a site, walk respectfully. Do not attempt to remove artifacts, and report lost, looted, or damaged places to local heritage authorities. If you are moved to tell these stories on platforms like YouTube, as many of you do so responsibly. Seek input from experts, give voice to descendant communities, avoid speculative sensationalism, and always remind your listeners that mystery is not a substitute for evidence. The urgency of preservation is real. Coastal erosion, development, and uninformed excavations are erasing records at a rate that is terrifying. If there is one practical step we can all take, it is to support local conservation efforts and public archaeology programs that prioritize care over clicks. Finally, hold the image that began our journey, the fog over a marsh, the shell ring like a thumbprint in the earth, the soapstone boulder glinting with peck marks, the carved human face catching slanted sun, the olive jar shard that once held wine in a 16th century fort, the mound where the horizon changes. All these images are acts of human labor and imagination. They speak to the same long human practices, making shelter and pottery, remembering the dead, shaping the world into a place where social life can be enacted with meaning. That thread, of people creating social worlds from materials at hand, binds the topper flake, the ring, the quarry, the petroglyph, Santa Elena, and the Santee mounds into a single human story. It is a story about ingenuity and about puzzlement, about the smallness and the grandeur of ordinary lives. It is also a reminder that knowing is often provisional. We hold theories lightly, revise them when evidence requires, and leave space for new methods to make old silences speak. So when you step off the trail and return to whatever daily life awaits you, take with you a different way of looking at a map, not only roads and place names but the palimpsests beneath, footprints of others, some visible, some buried. If you are a creator, tell the story with rigor. If you are a neighbor, protect the site. If you are a student, study the method and the ethics. And if you are simply a person who loves a good question, savor the unsettledness, not as an intellectual frustration but as an invitation to keep paying attention. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.